Hello YouTube. So I wanted to share a bit of research that I've done recently for my Acoustics and Psychoacoustics class at Brooklyn College, which is part of my Sonic Arts MFA. And the presentation is called Acoustic Realities of Small to Medium-Sized Rooms, Investigating the Acoustic Challenges and Solutions for the Average Room. So I'm sure as many home-based producers and engineers have experienced firsthand, is the acoustics of the somewhat small to mid-sized rooms that we tend to set up our studios in present certain challenges for monitoring our music properly and being able to hear what we're creating that's coming out of our speakers. And I imagine that we've also had the experience where we've created something in our studio at home that sounds amazing to our ears, and we're like, wow, this is it. I can't wait to share it with people. And we're listening to it in our car or in our earbuds on the way to the subway, and it sounds completely different. And we're like, wow, I'm glad I didn't share this with anyone because it sounds pretty horrible, or at least different from what we intended it to sound like. In my own endeavors, I've tried to learn and research why it is that music and sound can be so drastically affected depending on the room that we're in and how we're listening to it. And this is basically the basis for my own presentation for my Acoustics and Psychoacoustics class. So let's switch over to this presentation. And the second part of the presentation, or kind of the last part, is my own exploration in trying to build acoustic treatment, which begins to solve these issues. So you can see in my studio that I'm in right now, there are sound absorption panels. See how this works. Here, here. This is kind of strange. Everywhere, all around. And there's also a diffuser in the background right there. So the second part of this presentation, I will do my best to walk us through how I created this material and the effect of installing it in this room. So with that being said, let's start this presentation. So again, the title of this presentation is Acoustic Realities of Small to Medium-Sized Rooms, Investigating the Acoustic Challenges and the Solutions for the Average Room. Overview: the importance of proper monitoring conditions. 2, the acoustics of small to mid-sized rooms. 3, solutions for an optimized listening environment. And lastly, 4, goals and my own adventure. And actually, I'm going to save this last part for a second video. It's a bit involved and I think it needs its own focus. So to start off, the importance of proper monitoring conditions. This is a quote from the book Mixing Secrets for the Small Studio by Mike Sr. He says, when you consider that a typical untreated domestic acoustic environment will, in my experience, render roughly 2/3 of the money you spent on your speakers wasted, there's simply no excuse for inaction if you're serious about your craft. And this is a really, really great point, and the book is awesome. So much really useful information for producers and engineers in there. And that's me and Mike Sr. at the AES New York City convention in 2017. Really great to meet him and ask him questions in person, and really, really great guy. Second section, the acoustics of small to mid-sized rooms. So what do we hear when sound is generated by speakers? We hear two things. One, direct energy, basically the sound coming from the speakers. And two, we hear reflected energy. This is all of the sound that is reflected back to our ears. That's not directly from the speakers, but from the room. And so reflected energy consists of reflections. These are early and late reflections. Early reflections bounce off one surface and then come directly to your ear. Late reflections bounce off two or more surfaces and then come to your ears. And the second part of reflected energy are standing waves. These are room resonances, which we'll get into in a second, and also flutter, which we'll also get into in a second. So, as I just described, these are early reflections, and it's a very clear picture of what they are, what they look like. And these are late reflections bouncing off more than one surface before arriving at your ear. So room resonances, this is the second part. So based on the dimensions of our room, certain frequencies whose cycle is the same length or width or height of the room, these frequencies resonate in the room, kind of like a guitar string. So if I have a room that's 15 feet long, the frequency that has a wavelength of 15 feet will begin to resonate in the room as long as there's actually sound being produced by the speakers that is of that frequency. And not only will that frequency resonate in the room, but the overtones of the frequency will resonate as well. So we see here, this is the first mode, which you could call the fundamental. This is the second mode right here. And then this is the third mode right here. So just like the fundamental and harmonics of a guitar string, the dimensions of the room function in a similar way. And you can see here it's spelled out with specific example frequencies. These modes, they have points of maximal sound pressure and then also points of minimal sound pressure. So the points of maximal sound pressure, you can see kind of right here in this diagram, and these are the nodes. That's node, N-O-D-E, as opposed to mode, M-O-D-E. So these are the nodes. And then the points of minimal pressure are the antinodes, which you can see right here and right here. So in a sense, you could be hearing vastly different levels of sound depending on whether you're listening at the point of an antinode or a node. So you can see right here that there's these two people sitting in this room, and depending on if they're at the point of a node or antinode, they're hearing very, very different frequency responses, even though the same sound is playing in the room they're in. And so these resonances occur in three different ways, not just the length or the axial mode, but there's also a tangential mode and oblique mode. So you can see the tangential mode is a resonance that's created by reflecting off these four walls like that. And then an oblique mode occurs not just in the two-dimensional plane of the tangential mode, but actually in a three-dimensional plane. So these room modes basically function in many different ways. So they function in terms of length, width, height, and then also going back, for each of those, they function going between 2 walls, 4 walls, and then not just on the 2-dimensional plane, but the 3-dimensional plane. So we have many, many different modes that are present in a room, and they each, beyond just, these different variations we're looking at right now, they each have their own harmonics or different resonant modes. And then also we have aspects of flutter that happen in the room, which is sound that's not resonating between 2 walls based on the distance between the walls, but it basically gets stuck in between these 2 walls and just bounces back and forth until it dissipates. And this is called flutter. So in summary, these are some charts which depict what we just covered. So we have our initial sound, and then we have the primary or first or early reflections, and then we have our secondary or late reflections. And here's another picture of it. And then here is what flutter looks like between parallel walls. And then we also have the resonant modes that we had talked about. So these kinds of reflections cause many, many different problems when we're monitoring. So early and late reflections cause comb filtering. So the sound that is being bounced off one of the walls or surfaces can actually phase or interact with the sound coming from the speakers, which actually cancels out or boosts certain areas of the frequency spectrum that we're trying to hear, which creates an uneven frequency response based on what the speakers are actually playing. And then we have these standing waves, which is these flutter echoes. We mostly hear them with transients. For example, if you clap your hand while standing in between 2 untreated walls, you'll hear this bouncing back and forth of the sound. This, along with early and late reflections, tends to blur the sound we're trying to hear in the time domain. And these room resonances basically at points of the nodes and the antinodes, we hear these very, very potentially deep boosts and cuts. So if we're at the point of a node, which is along the wall, we're going to hear a large boost in the frequency spectrum. And if we're at the point of an antinode, we're going to hear a deep trough or cut. We might notice that if we're in a room where music is playing somewhat loudly, that's bassy, and we're standing next to the wall or in a corner, there's a bass boost. And this is because at the point of a node, the frequencies that are resonating with the dimensions of the room are boosted. So in a sense, when we're creating music, depending on where we're sitting in the room, the frequencies that are resonating with the particular dimensions of our particular room will likely be boosted or cut to a certain degree. And this doesn't happen just at one frequency point, but at many different frequency points, because we have usually 3 dimensions to our room, and there's all sorts of different modes and sequence or harmonics of these modes that are affecting what we're hearing. So the third part of my presentation is solutions for an optimized listening environment. These are things that we can do to minimize these kind of acoustical phenomena that happen in a negative way that detract from our ability to monitor properly in our room. So the 7 things I'd like to cover are A, good room choice, B, optimal listening position, C, proper speaker placement, D, eliminating direct reflections from angles of hard surfaces, E, absorption, F, diffusion, and G, software-based calibration. So, avoid small rooms. Their resonances interfere most with the frequencies we want to work with. So, for example, 60 hertz wavelength is 18.8 feet. 70 hertz is 16.1 feet. 100 hertz is 11.3 feet. And also we have to look at the half wavelength and quarter wavelength because these also will resonate in the given dimension. So at 40 hertz, the quarter wavelength is 7.1 feet, and in a lot of our spaces we might have a 8 to 10 foot ceiling. So for example, we might have a lot of issues with wavelengths that are 35-ish hertz, 55-ish hertz, and then up into the 110 hertz range. So in a sense, we can see how small rooms really will be detrimental because they really cause a lot of resonances with these mid-low frequencies that we need to be able to monitor very accurately. So as we can see in this chart, the larger the room size we get, the better we're going to be in terms of avoiding these resonances. Of course, all rooms, including bigger rooms, have these resonances, but the resonances tend to get pushed lower and lower frequency-wise the larger the room gets, to the point where they basically resonate frequencies that aren't really our concern when we're working on music. So this is a chart which also visualizes the dimensions of a room that might be ideal for us. So one thing to avoid are rooms with more than one pair of parallel surfaces that are the same distance apart. So these rooms produce modal coincidences, and these modes tend to gang up and exaggerate each other's effects. So this room is a not good room of 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet. All of these dimensions are the same. So you have these modal coincidences that will exist among the 3 dimensions of width, length, and height, and greatly exaggerate each other's effects and make it much more difficult to effectively treat. So a room with good dimensions would be one like this right here, where you see that all of the dimensions are quite different from each other. Also, what is great, although hard to come by, are rooms with non-parallel walls. So parallel walls obviously create an ideal space for sound to bounce back and forth in between. And once you take out the parallel spacing between them, sound doesn't really build up between two walls anymore. And it eliminates a lot of these modes that we will find troubling. So the second point is our listening position. So as we saw in the picture a while ago, depending where you're sitting in the room, whether it's a point of a node or antinode, which could occur in terms of width, length, or height of the room, you basically will be at a point where you're hearing large boosts or cuts in certain frequencies. So this is one kind of version of it, but what this chart is saying is that if you sit at the 50% length of the room, you're basically going to be sitting in likely an antinode or node and be invariably subjected to an uneven frequency response. However, if you're sitting at the 38% mark, which is neither 50 nor 33, but kind of an odd ratio room lengthwise, you're going to be at a more optimal place to avoid these nodes and antinodes. So this is another take on the same idea, which uses slightly different ratios, but the idea is the same. You don't want to be sitting at the 50% mark or the 33% mark or the 25% mark. Any one of those kind of whole number ratios are going to be dangerous. The third point is speaker placement. In a sense, it's similar to the concept that we just looked at with listening position in terms of the size of the room. With speaker placement, basically what can happen is that the sound that's bouncing off the walls near the speaker can get reflected back toward the listener, and the sound that's being reflected back phases with the sound that's still being produced by the speaker, and it creates comb filtering. And this will change the frequency response that we're hearing from the listening position. Actually, the closer you move the speaker to the wall, the less of an issue this is going to be, because the sound will bounce off the wall, but it will still be in phase with a lot of the lower frequencies that you're listening to. So the fourth thing we can do to optimize our listening situation is eliminate direct reflections from hard surfaces. So this should say direct reflections from hard surfaces. So it's pretty clear what can happen from these pictures, and it's similar to what we just looked at with the speaker's sound reflecting off the wall and causing comb filtering. So the same thing can happen with a desk or other surface that the sound might reflect off of and basically create an early reflection or a first reflection, which would come back to the listener, but phase with the direct sound from the speaker and cause some sort of comb filtering. So we might notice that a lot of mixing desks are built so that the way sound is reflected from the speakers once it hits them is not straight at the mixing engineer. And this is a example of a desk that has been designed to minimize these reflected sounds for the listener. And this is a chart that describes some of the comb filtering and room mood effects that might be heard from the listener's vantage point. You can see that the first one around the 38 hertz mark, there's a deep room cut of about maybe 7 or 8 decibels. And then a little higher in the frequency spectrum, we have several cuts from a comb filtering effect from reflections from a desk. Other reflections besides a desk could be from the floor or ceiling. So here's a similar chart that shows the effects of room modes again, and also reflections from the floor. So the next thing we can look at to optimize our listening situation is absorption. Depending on what kind of furniture and how much stuff, in a sense, we have in our room, absorption is likely happening to a certain degree, but it's usually not enough to cut down the amount of sound that's bouncing around randomly in the room and interfering with the sound that is coming from the speakers. Of course, we don't want to completely eliminate the sound being reflected in the room, otherwise we would be in an anechoic chamber, and no one mixes in an anechoic chamber because it's not a natural place to actually create and mix music. So no one listens to music in an anechoic chamber, so it would be kind of strange to create music in there and expect it to translate for the rest of the world. So we do want a degree of sound to be reflecting in the room, but usually a bit less than is going to be naturally reflecting in the room if it were left to its own devices. So we use absorption. And there's two kinds of absorption, basically. There's broadband absorption and membrane absorption. So broadband absorption is for treating a wide range of frequencies, and membrane is tuned to a specific frequency range. Broadband might look like this. The main functional part of broadband acoustic treatment is some sort of material that will just absorb sound. And a lot of the time what's used is some sort of acoustic insulation, like a mineral fiber or some sort of fiberglass, and or some sort of acoustic foam like the RLX foam I'm sure we've all seen before. And this is a chart that describes the acoustic absorption coefficients of these different types of insulation. So we might see that a fiberglass 4-inch panel absorbs best from 250 hertz up, but not too bad actually in the 125 hertz range. And generally, as the acoustic treatment is thicker, more volume, it has better performance. So membrane absorption is basically a membrane which is tuned to certain frequency ranges. And there's a lot of math that goes into this that I'm really not too familiar with. So there's some really great links at the bottom of this, and I'm linking in the description of this video the presentation here so you can get active links and check out the details of these membrane absorbers that are described much more thoroughly than I'm going to get into in this video. And here's some more information on constructing a membrane absorber and the math you would have to go through to design it properly for the frequencies you're targeting in your specific room. And this is an analysis of various membrane absorbers and their performance. And then a variation on the membrane absorber is the diaphragmatic absorber. And this is a diagram from Acoustic Fields, who make some really great treatment and also sell DIY plans. And so a diaphragmatic absorber, its basic principle is the mass and stiffness of its materials, and it responds to the most prevalent frequency buildup in a room rather than having to be tuned to a certain frequency. So the next part of optimizing a room I'd like to cover is diffusion. And what diffusion does is it breaks up reflections by diffusing the reflected sound energy over a wide area rather than having it bounce back in a focused way to the listener or around the room like a mirror. So rather than it being a mirror, it's kind of scatters the sound all over the room in different directions. So one issue with having only absorption in a room is it tends to soak up a lot of sound and create kind of an artificially dead room. But diffusion's great because it scatters these frequencies around the room. It creates a live sound to the room. So it eliminates certain issues with reflection in the room by dispersing the sound in different directions. So these diagrams on the left side of the screen show a before and after picture of a room treated with diffusers. So in the top diagram, we see that there's the direct sound, and then we get early reflections from the side wall and the floor and the ceiling. And then we have various reflections that happen from the rear wall and sound that just is reflected back from around the room. And then the after diagram shows that we have our direct sound, and then there's really no early reflections that are bouncing off to blur the sound image from our speakers. And in a sense, and then after we have a really nicely tapered number of diffused late reflections. And to the right, we have a diagram which shows what happens to the sound when it hits absorption, diffusion, or when it's reflected without any treatment. So the first one is absorption. So we see that it hits this absorber and then it bounces off in kind of a attenuated way. And so we have our direct signal here, and then a little bit later an attenuated reflection, and then spatially we have the signal coming in, and then we have a little bit on the kind of right side of this diagram, a attenuated reflection. Now the diffusion, just to skip down, it hits this diffuser and then it scatters ideally evenly in all different directions. And this diagram here shows that, which is very similar to the one we saw over here on the left. And one thing that diffusion does really nicely is it allows the sound to bounce around the room and creates a very balanced stereo response throughout the room, as we see in this diagram here. So this page, I've combined a few different images that show what happens to sound when it hits a diffuser. So we can see the top here. This is without any kind of diffusion, reflecting off a hard surface. This is an irregular surface, which does diffuse the sound to a certain degree, but not necessarily evenly. This might be akin to if you have a bookshelf in the wall which is reflecting the sound in different directions, but not necessarily in a planned, even way. And then we have a diffuser here, which is reflecting the sound evenly. And then you can see here in this moving picture exactly how the sound reflects off a diffuser. I like this picture right here. It just kind of scatters the sound. And then this is a simulation of a fractal diffuser right here. I'm just going to move ahead a little bit. What happens when the sound hits this diffuser? Pretty cool. So that's diffusion. So we have different kinds of diffusers. I'm not going to get into the differences between them, but I've included links here which will show you the response patterns of different diffusers. This is a stepped diffuser and a fractal diffuser and a quadratic diffuser and a primitive root or skyline diffuser. So some important things in summary that we want to keep in mind when treating our room for optimal listening conditions is we basically want the early reflections to be about 15 decibels lower than the direct signal. We want an even reverberation time across the frequency spectrum. So we will have reflected sound. That's good. That's a good thing. But we want that the frequency spectrum is evenly reflecting or reverberating throughout the room. We don't want a lot of reflection or reverberation, maybe with certain low frequencies, but then not much in a mid-high, or we don't want deep boosts and cuts in the reverberation frequency spectrum. And then depending on the room size, we want an RT60 value from about 100 milliseconds to 500 milliseconds. So again, we do want sound to reflect and reverberate, but we don't want it to be too dead, and we also don't want it to be too dead, and we also don't want it to be too live in the room. So this is a picture I took which has a few important key points in studio design. This is from the MixCon 2017 conference in New York City. Select a geometry and ratio with minimal modal issues. The control room or listening room should be symmetrical for proper imaging. So just to clarify, you can have non-parallel walls, but the room should be symmetrical. So the live room should be asymmetrical. We haven't talked about live rooms, but that's important. Absorb the low frequency by using tuned absorbers, which are the membrane absorbers we talked about, and broadband low frequency absorption. Minimize or eliminate unwanted reflections at mix points. Optimize listener and loudspeaker location. Use rear wall diffusion, which is appropriate for the room. The deeper the room, typically the diffuser should go lower in frequency. Typically diffuse 60% of the rear walls area. Avoid overusing absorption. Strategically use diffusion where required. Room must have a balanced selection of acoustic treatments. So there it is. I hope this has been a helpful video in terms of understanding the acoustic properties and realities and solutions of small to mid-sized rooms, and B, as a launching point or jumping off point to design and build your own acoustic treatment to solve the room challenges that you might be experiencing yourself. And again, originally this video was going to be including a section on how I designed and built my own acoustic treatment, but it ended up being way too long. So there's a part 2 to this video. Definitely check it out if you're interested. There should be a link popping up on the screen at the end of this video, or you can just search for it. But I'm going to get into more details about how I built some of my own treatment. And so thanks so much for listening. Again, the document that I referenced will be shared below, and I hope you are able to really make some awesome music and go ahead and produce and mix super confidently. Thanks so much for watching.